Okay. Well, hi everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Let's see. Let's get this going. So I'm actually not going to give you a whole lot of data today. I'll give you some. But what I was asked to talk about is kind of what sustainability is within the context of how it's being managed. And I'm going to spend some time talking about kind of in the corporate context, which is where I spend most of my time, elevate that a little bit to the global context, which is important to keep in mind when we're operationalizing sustainability within an organization, and then spend some time and kind of put my adjunct professor hat on for a moment, and then kind of bring it down to what do we look for in individuals to help drive sustainability. Most people who do sustainability don't necessarily have it in their job titles or their job description. So we'll talk about kind of what that looks like. And I think we've carved some time for Q&A, so I'll try to keep some time for that. I tend to use a lot of slides and move through them quickly so that I can leave you with a lot of just kind of thought starters. So if I go through too quickly on something, just kind of remember that and ask me about it. So the few things I really want to leave with you today, one is sustainability as a practice, as a function, is actually maturing inside of organizations because frankly the business case is becoming more and more compelling. And so we'll talk about this idea of we do it because it's the right thing to do actually is really changing to because it's the right thing to do for the business or for the organization. On the flip side of that, frankly, both the costs and the risks of not acting on sustainability are quickly becoming unacceptable both to society, but actually to insurance companies, to investors, to regulators, et cetera. So there's a shift, and we'll talk about that. Business is actually in a great place, mostly kind of unrecognized and still kind of below the radar. As I always tell my students who are wondering whether they should consider working in corporate sustainability, I said, hey, business is where change is most needed, but it's also where it's most possible, and where we tend to be able to act faster, certainly than policy can guide us. For example, I'll also kind of talk about this notion of table stakes increasing and kind of picked a few kind of key trends that are seen as kind of what are the emerging things that we're likely going to talk about in the coming years in this field. And then last but not least, again, this notion of the emergence of sustainability leadership and what that is. So you got a quick intro about me. I just thought I'd pick two pictures out of my life. I actually graduated from ASU 25 years ago this month. I was an August graduate. I was really into scuba diving, and I really enjoyed diving. And the more I dived, the more I realized, as soon as you got below the surface, there was actually a lot of junk there and a lot of garbage. And that just didn't make the experience very fun. I'm originally French. I grew up in Paris, France, and in my youth, one of my heroes was Jacques Cousteau, who spent a lot of time trying to get people to fall in love with the oceans, not trying to make people feel bad that they were polluting the oceans, make people feel good that these were things worth protecting. And he spent all his life trying to show us what that world was like. And so that was very inspiring to me. Fast forward, this picture here, 2012, I was invited with a group of sustainability leaders to go spend a week deep into the Amazon rainforest in Brazil to really kind of basically coalesce on how do we move this field forward. And for me, the key lesson there was if you mess with one thing, you mess with everything. The rainforest is an amazing ecosystem for its richness, but also for its massive interdependency and fragility as a result. And so I thought I would just give you these kind of two touch points beyond kind of the bio in terms of me. What I've done in between those two, I've been in sustainability now for about 5 years. I've been at Dell 10, but my first 5 years at Dell, and before that I spent 10 plus years with Charles Schwab in financial services. But for about 15 years, my job was kind of the bleeding edge of e-commerce and the moving the internet as a platform through both organizations and kind of customer market facing applications. So from the mid-90s on at Charles Schwab, we were really, bringing the internet forward as a platform for individual investing. And for those of you who were around, you remember back in the day, you engaged with the stock market with those last pages in the newspaper. You needed to get the magnifying glass out. And then all of a sudden, the internet became a platform where you could literally have access to an enormous amount of information, have access to act on that information for better or for worse. And the internet was a massively disruptive platform. It's not like people sat around saying, oh, this internet thing, I don't want it. But it brought about an enormous amount of change to organizations, to communities, to government, to societies. And sustainability is a lot like that. Most people don't sit around saying, oh, I don't want cleaner air, I don't want cleaner water, I don't want less waste. But what we need to do to move sustainability forward is actually really disrupting well-oiled processes, certainly in business. And so that disruption, that change, breeds discomfort, resistance, cost sometimes. So we'll talk about that. So what do I really do at Dell? When people ask me, so sustainability, what do you do? I said I do three things. I help drive the business, I help reduce risk or mitigate risk, and I help enhance the brand. That's what I do. How I do it is a long laundry list of things that look and feel like sustainability, that give us license to operate, manage hidden risk or not so hidden risks, engage our employees to drive talent acquisition, talent retention. I heard about recruiting just a minute ago. When we're competing for talent in innovative industries, the brand that you put around your company matters. And so sustainability is actually a huge driver of talent acquisition and retention. Actually, I think the one population that is most likely to read your sustainability report are your prospective employees or prospective students, probably in your case. So how did we get to that? Dell has been at sustainability now officially for about 18 or so years. Some people would say when Michael Dell created the company now 30 years ago, he really brought sustainability to IT. This whole just-in-time manufacturing, this kind of build-to-order, reduced an enormous amount of overhead and waste into the way computers were brought to market. Very early on in the early 90s, we were collaborating with recyclers, bringing them into the design shops to say, how do we design computers that will be easier to recycle and to disassemble in this case? Because something is recyclable, that's great, but it will only be recycled if somebody can make money doing that. The fact is, the recycling business is a very low-margin business, and if it takes 30 minutes of labor for somebody to take apart your product, doesn't matter how recyclable it is, it will likely not get recycled because nobody's going to make money doing it. So those are the kinds of things we've been at for a while. And in fact, for a while, actually in the mid-2000s, Michael Dell said, I want Dell to be the greenest IT company in the world. And that was great. And that led us to do a lot of things around our facilities, use of renewable energy, waste, e-waste, et cetera. And we're still doing that, and it still matters. But as we've matured, we've kind of started moving up this ladder of really looking at the end of the day, we make products that help people do more. Dell is sometimes better known as a consumer company because you see Dell products at things like Best Buy or Walmart, but in fact that's only about 5% of our business. Most of our business is in the enterprise, large corporations, public agencies, governments, data centers, most of the search engines or social networks you use. When you're hitting that like button or hitting that search button, you're probably hitting a Dell server in the background. We're the #1 IT provider to the healthcare sector, now 4 years running. So we do a lot in healthcare technology. And so when we talk about customers, and when you hear me talk about customers, think more in the enterprise space than in the more in the consumer, although I'll touch on consumer. And so more and more we're finding that our customers are also working with sustainability and looking at how does technology help them achieve that. So that's where we're now looking more at how do we connect what we do for a living, bringing technology solutions to the world, as a way to accelerate sustainability, whether it's dematerializing something. So for example, the IT footprint could go up and another type of footprint could go down. That's very evident in healthcare. For example, digital medicine electronic medical records, cloud-based clinical archives, et cetera. You elevate the IT footprint of the organization, but then you offset millions of pounds of paper, X-ray film, storage boxes, storage rooms, et cetera. So those are the kinds of things we think about. So when you take a broader lens at the corporate sector in general, and what success used to be in this field of sustainability, it used to be very kind of compliance-driven, a little bit of just kind of defensive, if you will. It used to be, well, we'll disclose what we do and so start making voluntary disclosures and sustainability reporting. A lot about making operations more efficient, and that certainly still matters and frankly is usually one of the strongest business cases because inefficient operations are inherently wasteful. And not just wasteful in terms of the environment, but in terms of money. If you use too much energy, too much water, if you generate too much waste, that means you're paying for too much material that you're not using, et cetera. A lot of compliance-driven activities, a lot, again, kind of managing reputation, right? I mean, you can think back to the early 90s when Nike got caught in this whole kind of sweatshop scandal, and that really helped drive their now leadership around things like sustainable apparel, but at the time it was really a defensive move. So mostly about let's do less bad, if you will. I'm not going to try to define sustainability for you because there's about as many definitions as there are people trying to define it, but it's fundamentally the ability to sustain, right? So something that is not sustainable is something that if you keep doing it, at some point your ability to do it ends. Right? If you spend more money than you make, at some point, your ability to do that stops because you're out, right? If we fish faster than fish can reproduce, at some point, that stops, right? If we cut trees faster than they can grow back, at some point, that stops. So that's this broad notion of sustainability. So the less bad is the idea of how do we slow that down, but it doesn't necessarily mean it gets better. So we've made a lot of progress. There's a lot of things that have happened, again, and I'll touch on it to give some more examples in the corporate sector, but business has really figured out, again, business is fundamentally in the business of wanting to stay in business. And so sustainability is really becoming part of the language of how do we make sure that not just in the next quarterly earnings cycle, and at Dell, for those of you who follow the market, we actually went private about 18 months, so actually almost 2 years ago now. Michael Dell bought the company back from Wall Street. He was getting fed up, and these are his words, not mine, with the short-termism of Wall Street. And so we are no longer tied to quarterly earnings cycles and investors. Most corporations are, but finding a way still to think longer term, because again, your responsibility to your investors and to your shareholders and to your employees is, how do we make sure we're still around 5-10 years out so that people still have jobs and we still create value for our shareholders, et cetera. So from disclosure, I'd say we've moved into an era of transparency. So disclosure is very kind of gated and metered. Transparency is really about, we'll just let you see what you want to see and help us interpret what it means. I'd say from compliance now we have more governance, so it's a little bit less defensive and it's more thoughtful in terms of, so how do we manage through this stuff? How do we make thoughtful decisions about it? A lot of goals, so you see a lot of organizations with renewable energy goals or things like zero waste, which of course is never actually zero waste, but that's what they're often called. A lot of activities around employee engagement, stakeholder engagement. So the stakeholder is beyond the shareholder, right? It could be your communities, in your case, your students, your regulators, et cetera. More and more companies really looking at how to make their products and services more sustainable. A lot of collaboration happening, what we call often pre-competitive collaboration. We collaborate actually a lot with the likes of Apple, HP, IBM, Intel, et cetera, in areas that are not competitive so that we can spread the cost, spread the risk, and actually accelerate the outcomes. So again, it's still mostly, what we would qualify as less bad. So it's better, but it's not necessarily something that would be still considered sustainable. So let me move briefly into this broader context. So when we make all these decisions as organizations, what are we really looking at and what are we thinking about? One of these contexts is there's a global risk report that's put out by the World Economic Forum every year, released at Davos. conference, and they interview basically CEOs and prominent people around the world and ask them to rank their global risks that they see, both in terms of likelihood and impact. And you may or may not be able to read, but all the ones that are circled are squarely in the realm of sustainability, both in terms of likelihood and impact. In terms of impact, the two most damaging things globally would be things like a water-related crisis or spread of infectious diseases, which is at the heart of the connection between sustainability and global health. Things like weapons of mass destruction is only third. War or interstate conflict is fourth. Fifth, failure of climate change adaptation. Things like a fiscal crisis, another global meltdown, is only number 8. So, you see how this is now the global business community, the global economic community views these things. So just in the concept of where these things fit, and now this is another art chart, and by the way, you'll have access to these slides if you want them, but there's work that's done in terms of what are those global megatrends where you see things like rising income disparity or urbanization or rise of chronic diseases or rise of hyperconnectivity, everybody being connected to the grid. And for better or for worse, for those of you who have these little things in your car now, that was just reading now that people have found how to hack into your car through the, so like that's a trend of when everything's connected, everything's a bit more vulnerable. And so the things in the middle are all those global risks and how they're connected. So we look at those things to try to understand how does this fit inside of a broader risk model for an organization like ours. And then there are more actionable things. So this group called the Risky Business Coalition put this large document out called the Risky Business Report, a climate risk assessment for the United States. And it wasn't put out by environmental groups or even, frankly, government. This was chaired by Hank Paulson, former chairman of Goldman Sachs and former Treasury Secretary for President Bush, by Robert Rubin, who's also a former Treasury Secretary, by George Shultz, former Secretary of State for Bush 1, Michael Bloomberg, et cetera. So this is a very business-centric, very financially driven assessment of what are the climate risks of the United States down to, frankly, sector and state level. And I'll show you a picture for Arizona in a minute. But this basically says, here's what it's going to cost if we don't do it, and why it's going to cost a lot less to deal with the problem than to ignore the problem. Because again, one of the key messages that's starting to emanate is the cost of inaction is actually going to be the highest. So when people say, oh, this stuff's going to be expensive, it's kind of like, oh, going to the dentist is going to cost money. It's like, yeah, but not going to the dentist is actually worse, right? Because it never gets better on its own. All right, since we're all here, let's talk briefly about Arizona. So Arizona, so this is a view of the Risky Business Report. It takes it down to actually state, even down to parts of the state. It estimates all kinds of things. Again, very financially driven analysis of what different scenarios of climate change are going to do to things like health outcomes, agricultural yields, energy prices, et cetera. So there's actionable information even down to state level. Now, one of the things we did actually with one of my ASU interns was to look at, so what is business in Arizona doing? Because I actually presented this to the Arizona Chamber of Commerce a few weeks ago, because to me, they're not necessarily telling the story of what business in Arizona is doing. So I said, let's look at the largest employers in Arizona. So of the top 50 employers, 47 are private, and here they are. Collectively, they employ close to 15% of people in Arizona. They are, many are very large. Some, again, less than 3,000. You can see the distribution here. But again, these companies represent over 350,000 employees in the Valley. You probably know people who work for one of these. So let's look. Out of this 47, 45 of them have, and this is all public information, so we didn't go talk to them and say, okay, tell us what you're up to. This is literally public information that they publish in their reports on their website. 45 out of 47 have publicly available sustainability initiatives. 44 have actually goals. So sometimes you can say, well, here's what we're doing, but you don't necessarily have a goal that you're trying to hit, but 44 out of the 47 actually have specific goals. 2/3 of them actually publish a full-blown sustainability report, which really demonstrates a commitment to measurement. Because again, you can have goals and interests and ambitions, but sometimes your measurement methodology and maturity is not quite there. So just a few examples. Again, you'll recognize some of these names, right? So for example, PetSmart is doing a lot in the again. Zero waste, in this case, zero waste is 90% diversion from landfill. That means only 10% of your waste may end up in landfill. And these are just examples, by the way. Again, I have slides on almost each of these that shows all of their initiatives. They also have things like around water, energy. You see Wells actually very aggressive goals in their operations. In terms of waste, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of water efficiency, energy efficiency, LEED buildings, when you know how many buildings they own, that's actually a pretty significant number because they own a lot of small buildings, right? All these branches, et cetera. Wells is actually also doing a lot in the area of sustainable finance. So they've got a huge commitment to put an increasingly large percentage of their loan portfolio towards sustainable initiatives, green entrepreneurship, et cetera. Intel's doing also amazing things. I get to work with them pretty closely. They're actually the largest purchaser of green power in this country. As you can see, they spend a lot on electricity, over $1 billion a year just on electricity. Like a Dow Chemical spends about $2 billion a year. We spend a lot less. We're just at about 100 million, just a bit less. But even then, when you talk to an organization about, hey, let's help you conserve energy, it's not just because it's good for the planet, but there's actually some very, very real bottom line implications for that. Even in very kind of, let's say not consumer-facing industries like Raytheon, you see that with, I got to do some work with the likes of Northrop Grumman and others also in defense and military. They also have all kinds of groups, actually the IAG, the International Aerospace Environmental Group, where Raytheon, Honeywell, Boeing, Halliburton, all of that, they actually met in Scottsdale a few months ago. I got to talk to them about some of what we're doing. They're actually doing some interesting things in their field. So I think the punchline here is business is actually doing quite a bit, and most of it because it's good for business. This isn't altruistic, frankly. This is no longer really driven from a place of, oh, if we don't do it, people are going to hate us. These things make sense. They really do. All right, so moving quickly, as I promised, let's talk about some of those mega trends I talked about that I think are really going to help shape what the future looks like. One of them, and I spend actually a lot of time in this field, that we commonly refer to as sustainable procurement. And you may do some of it already. For example, when you procure, let's say, paper, and you say, hey, we want paper, so that's either, includes some recycled content, or maybe we want materials for our classrooms, or maybe in building operations, you say, you want facilities that are going to, have a plan for how to not use excessive amounts of water on the construction site, or whatever that might be. But the rise of sustainable procurement is that you're basically using your procurement dollars to shape sustainable practices in your suppliers. So we collectively, just Dell spends about, $35 billion a year with suppliers. That's a lot of purchasing power. The GSA, the federal government's Global Services Administration, spends, hundreds of billions of dollars. The state of Arizona, all of us as organizations. So when we tell our suppliers, hey, if you want my business, I expect more of this or that, it gets results more, frankly, than any kind of NGO or environmental activism can get. You see that a lot in things like hospitality. Now large conference centers, hotels will tell you we can't get corporate business for things like conventions, et cetera, unless we have a very specific plan of how we're making our facilities more sustainable. Even in Vegas, I got to tour that recently. The large resorts now they look very kind of, decadent and exuberant, but in fact, for example, that huge water feature at the Aria, if you've been there, consumes actually less net water than your backyard swimming pool. They've got like very sophisticated reuse technology there. So this notion of basically, we're using our procurement dollars to push sustainable practices into our supply chain is an increasing movement. We see it at Dell. Again, we are on the receiving end of a lot of sustainable procurement. We sell to almost every government in the world. We sell to almost every large corporation in the world, and they're making more and more demands in terms of things like energy efficiency, recyclability, supply chain responsibility, like things like human rights, environmental protection, et cetera. So this one, I think, more than anything, is the hidden force that's really driving a lot of sustainable practices. I mentioned things like some of the defense contractors, et cetera. This is a lot of what's pushing them, because they sell to governments, US and elsewhere, who are implementing sustainable procurement practices. Another one that I see is, for those of you who follow this, China is really like at the edge of the precipice. Some would argue the edge was like 10 feet behind them. In terms of, and it's dramatic. They're having some very, very significant health impacts, not just in their air quality. About 35% of China's water has basically become unusable because of how polluted it is. A lot of their land now, about 30% of their arable land, is no longer farmable because of how polluted it is. And as we know, their population's growing. They need places to be. They need food to eat. They certainly need water to drink. And actually, both by China and by outside observers, they say if China doesn't address their environmental concerns, they're likely going to face a significant amount of civil unrest, potentially at some point another revolution. Because, when your kids are dying, frankly, like there's a whole new level of motivation there. And we saw that in places like Tunisia and Syria. Syria, in fact, you don't often hear about that, but a lot of the unrest that took place in Syria was on the tail end of about a 4-year extended drought, with about 1 million climate refugees moving in and around Damascus and creating all kinds of situations that hadn't been there before. So when you look at why the Pentagon calls climate change the #1 risk to national security, it's a lot of this kind of stuff. Is that, when even back in the day, like Rwanda and Darfur, these guys were fighting over water more than anything else. Yeah, there were ethnic divisions, but the battleground was things like water. Same with Libya. So this stuff is real, and I think China, because of obviously their size, their global power, and frankly their connection to the U.S. economy, the global economy. Most of what we buy it comes from there. So if somehow that gets disrupted for organizations like us, we certainly pay attention. Another trend is this notion of accounting for nature. And this may sound basic, but it's actually revolutionary if we start doing it well. This notion that, again, corporate accounting, balance sheet, right? What are your assets? What are your liabilities? Your income statement? What are your costs or income? What are your expenses? Most of the services nature provides are not accounted for. So let's say you're Coca-Cola, and you expect that in order to bottle your product, you're going to have ready access to water. Let's say you build a bottling plant on the side of a river, and you expect that river to just keep flowing and that you could keep pumping water out of it. Well, what if that water no longer gets to you? And actually that's happened to Coke. They literally have $100 million plants sitting next to empty riverbeds. This notion of what is that worth? The fact that that river is going to keep flowing. Let's say I'm in the field of agriculture. The fact that pollinators like bees or butterflies are going to keep pollinating. What is that worth to me? In fact, somebody did the math and said, if pollinators like bees and butterflies didn't do that job and we had to mechanize that, and there's work, including at ASU, to say, so how do we replace bees? It's about $280 billion for the US agricultural sector. So bees do it for free. And I can promise you it's going to cost less than $280 billion to protect bees than it is to replace them. So it's that kind of accounting. It's to say there's different, natural capital accounting, ecosystems, services, pricing, but it's this notion of we take it for granted that nature renders services for our organizations, and we have to do some math around what is that worth to us. And again, when there's a decision to make of I can spend money to protect that or to potentially pay down the road to replace it, to do, again, this is kind of typical kind of net present value of money, et cetera. I'm sure there's math faculty over there, they could do that way better than I could. But this is a trend, it's starting. You'll see it most presently right now in companies that have a very direct reliance on things like forest products, agriculture, and water. In our world, because we don't have reliance on those at Dell, the one where we're starting is this idea of carbon pricing, and you see companies like actually Microsoft, Disney, others have started to put an internal price on carbon, expecting that at some point governments are actually going to start putting a price on carbon. But anyway, so this is something I think we're going to start looking at more. This notion of, so I talked about transparency, but this notion of radical transparency, that this idea between, the fact that we all carry smartphones around, the police forces are discovering now what radical transparency means, that almost every time there's an arrest now or something, somebody's capturing that event and then showcasing it to the world, for better or for worse. We can capture heroic actions or sometimes things that would be considered, performance management issues at the minimum. But, we think about that. We think about that in our factories. Same thing. We rely on things like audits that happen every few months, maybe every couple of years, where the fact is that employees in our factories who may be witnessing things that aren't up to code, literally have the ability to capture it in real time, maybe broadcast it in real time. So this idea that, you can kind of manage that story around your practices, and you can say, well, we're not quite ready. Maybe in 5 years we'll deal with this. Like, you're no longer really in control of when the stories get told, and you have to be ready to adjust to that. This is something, again, that this program Michelle mentioned earlier. I helped design and develop this executive masters for sustainability leadership. But this idea of sustainability as a leadership platform, it's no longer, sustainability is not the goal, right? Somebody always jokes, that if you say, hey, how's your marriage? Oh, it's sustainable. That it's not really something you aspire to. Sustainability isn't what you hope to achieve. It's how you choose to do whatever it is that you're going to do. So it's a leadership platform. It's a strategic lens. It's, you look through the lens of sustainability at the things you really want, things like prosperity, like growth, like security, etc. Okay? We're seeing this a lot already, but this notion of sustainable innovation, creating new trends, new models, new markets. I have this picture here. We've actually been innovating a lot in the field of packaging, using things like agricultural waste. We actually now make a cardboard-like product for our products that's actually made out of wheat straw. And wheat straw is basically the waste that's left on the field once the wheat has been harvested. And in most cases, wheat straw actually gets burnt on the field by the farmer because there's no value even in displacing it to somewhere else. So it's bad for the air, and it's a waste for the farmer. Now, we pay farmers a small price to basically get their wheat straw. We turn it into a cardboard-like product that uses 90% less water and 40% less electricity to make it like cardboard with the same qualities. We've also experimented with other materials in packaging like bamboo, like mushroom. And oh, by the way, we just published our sustainable packaging initiatives have saved us over $50 million in the last few years. So not only is this better for us, it's better for the environment. Our customers love it because now they have 100% recyclable or compostable even packaging, and it's really helped our bottom line. You see things like the circular economy, something that's being talked about a lot of, rather than go, extract at the source, transform it, make it into a product, sell it, dispose of it, and then start again. This notion of how do we do more closed loop type of things? Either closed loop inside an organization, like in our case, we're actually now making new computers based on some of the materials from old computers. You see Intel doing a lot of work actually with closed loop water systems. So Intel's an enormous user of water, but in fact they're actually not really a big net user of water in the valley because they are very, very smart at how they reuse water. You also have open loop systems. For example, I mentioned aerospace earlier. Boeing uses carbon fiber for now their new airplanes, and as you would imagine, they have a very high threshold in terms of the quality, the tolerance, etc. The bottom of this laptop, for example, is carbon fiber, not quite as rigorous in terms of airplane level quality. So we actually, for example, work with companies like Boeing to take their waste carbon fiber to make to take into the what we need, because we don't need the parts to be as big or sometimes to have the same very, very high tolerances in terms of quality. Internet of Things, if you've heard about that, a big deal in our business. It's this notion of how do we connect everything. So in some cases, it's your smart toaster or your smart fridge that's going to tell you when you're out of milk and automatically send that information to your smartphone or maybe your thermostat. But it's also things like putting sensors in agriculture, so that as soon as we start doing things like smart irrigation, and your Wi-Fi enabled sensors that know that, one, the water density of the soil right now, but also that know, if there's an 80% chance of rain in the next 36 hours, for example, I'm not going to water right now. I'm going to wait to see what happens with the weather. That kind of stuff. Massive improvements. All of these types of things that have been piloted have yielded amazing results. In the case of smart irrigation, about 40% less water use. So it's less water use, and then there's actually a lot less runoff into things like rivers and all the dead zones in the Gulf. And so there's lots of advantages to that. So this innovation is actually creating new markets. The Internet of Things is now predicted to be about a $30 or $40 billion economy that didn't really exist before. Circular economy. There's all kinds of new models. I'm going to keep moving. There's a few. One, we actually did some measurement recently. Most American companies now, well, actually most global companies, but we look particularly at the U.S., are very officially now recognizing climate change as a threat to their business, even the ones you wouldn't necessarily count on. I mean, you go to like ExxonMobil.com and they have a whole piece on, okay, this is how we perceive it to be a risk to our global business. They're not necessarily saying they're going to stop, being in the fossil fuel business, but they're recognizing that there's a very real threat to their business. Another key trend is, the employee is now quite engaged in sustainability programs. The stakeholders, so again, beyond the shareholder, the communities, the regulators, the NGOs, those kinds of things. The one that's kind of been missing to the party so far is the consumer. And there's a big question mark as to when will the consumer really be that driving force. I mentioned sustainable procurement earlier. And this is obviously kind of the business to business or government to business type of spending. But the consumer, at the end of the day, when you go to the grocery store, when you go to Best Buy, or when you go to the restaurant, how do you vote with your wallet? And there's plenty of reasons why that hasn't really happened on a large scale yet. One, for a while, green products were just not as good. I mean, it'd be great to buy the green kind of, equivalent of Windex or something. It just didn't work as well. The green food product or whatever, it's not quite as good. So, I think there's a lot of work happening now to where performance is at parity in some cases. If you look at products like Tesla, Tesla, very sustainable car, but that's not why people buy it, because it's a really cool car. And so, the more we see that, things also like sustainable apparel, sustainable textile, it's actually not only better for your health, but it's actually feels better, now tends to actually have longer longevity as well. So there's a performance and durability. A lot of collaboration, that's been happening, but there's frankly a lot more of it. And you see, if you follow the news in the realm of sustainability, again, all kinds of strange bedfellows getting together in various things. We're part of a program around closed loop, where it's like we're working with Nike, with General Motors, with Dow Corning. Companies you wouldn't necessarily expect to work together. It's just we all have shared interests. We all produce things that generate waste that somebody might use so our outputs could be their input, or vice versa. I mentioned Boeing with the carbon fiber, so a lot of stuff like that. Again, you're seeing the sustainable product portfolios actually starting to pivot. Unilever, right, the huge mega company that makes a lot of the products probably that you find on the shelves of your grocery store, there's this program called their Sustainable Living Plan, and they've just recently announced actually all of their products in their Sustainable Living Plan are outperforming the rest of their products financially. You see that also actually at Procter & Gamble. You see General Electric in the industrial space. Their whole eco-imagination business is now about a $20 billion business, is outgrowing the rest of their businesses. So sustainability more and more is starting to pay or to pay off, again, in the marketplace. Monetizing strategies related, but it's this notion of, again, how do you pay for the investments you make? Because, our friends in facilities or otherwise will tell you when somebody has a good idea, it's very quick to come up with what's going to cost, but it's not quite as quick sometimes to figure out what's that going to be worth. What's the value of doing that? I could tell you right now, if you want to do this, how much it's going to cost to do it, but sometimes the value, what's it worth, it takes a little bit longer. So this notion of how do we monetize these things so that the payoff, and then when we work with our finance folks and things like internal rates of return and return on investment. And then again, I mentioned this earlier, this notion of just being a good citizen, corporate citizen in this case, it's no longer a selling point. It's no longer enough. You have to really make the business case. All right, I'll just go through a few slides now just to kind of quickly to say, so all this stuff happens and it's great, but it mostly happens because you have committed individuals inside of organizations who are starting to move the needle. And you see a lot of what we call intrapreneurship inside of organizations, people who are doing entrepreneurial things. And this isn't some kind of coalescence and kind of symbiotic, everybody wakes up one day and say, oh, we should do this. You have individuals inside of organizations. Actually, Thomas is a good example. At SCC, for example, we have several at Dell. Our packaging guy, his name is Oliver Campbell, was the driving force behind a lot of our programs and really kind of pushing. And now, it's become a global thing, saved us over $50 million. But at the end of the day, what are we looking for in individuals? And again, I'm talking about individuals not necessarily who have sustainability in the job title, but whatever it is that you do, and you look through the lens of sustainability and say, how can I do what I do more sustainably? And so, usually we want you to start with this idea of a vision, to kind of think out of what is that future that I want? What stories do I want to be able to tell when I'm done with some of this stuff? And what are the kinds of things that are going to inspire and mobilize people in my organization? How do you tap into things like culture, and language inside an organization? Vision's great to kind of, again, get people inspired, but at some point you need to start focusing and bringing more of a strategic thinking. It's like, okay, if that's the future we want, what's it going to take? Strategic thinking really helps you understand that. And again, here you're not really wanting per se to do a sustainability strategy. You want a business strategy that's sustainable, or you want an organizational strategy that's sustainable. And so again, also aligning with the organization's culture, those who are really trying to go counter current and really move upstream, going against the grain of what their organization's about. I mean, if you go work for ExxonMobil and you say, we should stop being in the fossil fuel business, you're not going to be very successful. Yeah. And so it's about how do you take what you do and help make it better over time. Goals. Again, at the end of the day, it's great to have vision, it's great to have a strategy, but goals are really the measures of your ambition. You saw some of the goals that I showed earlier there when somebody says, I'm going to reduce my waste to landfill by 90%. That gives you a sense that they're serious about it, and then usually they kind of tell you how they're going to measure that. But so goals are defined in terms of what happens when you've met them, and it really starts bringing focus, because then we know how to do that, right? We have the capabilities of things like anywhere from Lean and Six Sigma or program management, project management. It's like, here's where we are, here's where we need to be, here's how we'll measure whether we're there. What do we do from plan A to plan B, right? Or step A to step B. So that's what plans are for. You develop a baseline. Where are we now? If you say, we need to reduce energy by X. Okay, well, where are we now? You'd be surprised at actually how many organizations don't know exactly how much energy they consume or how much fuel they burn in their fleets or whatever. It's not easy. I mean, if you've got thousands of vehicles in your organizational fleet, to be able to say, yeah, we burn X amount of fuel every day, and let's reduce that by this much, or even how much you spend on it. Sometimes they can tell you one, but they can't tell you the other. Again, key performance indicators, developing the business case is, again, wherever you are in the organization, understanding why is this worth doing, not just for society, but for the organization, because that really helps you move it forward. You know, at the end of the day, plans and strategies and visions and goals are great, but you got to execute. You have to have a drive for result. You have to move the teams forward. So how do you build governance around your programs? How do you manage to your key performance indicators? How do you trust the functional experts to own and drive? I think that's one of the key lessons in sustainability is you don't want to create an ivory tower around sustainability. You want a relatively small central team and then really trust your experts, whether it's in facilities, whether it's in design, whether it's in operations, whether it's in procurement, to do what they do with sustainability in mind. You can't have a procurement person here and a sustainability person here and expect sustainable procurement to happen. And then communication, a lot of communication, both outward, but also really good listening to the communities, listening to the stakeholders, you know, tailoring the communication to the needs of the audience, and then providing narrative, again, not just data. The data is important, but it doesn't tell the story, right? If data was enough to move this stuff forward, I mean, if data was enough, tobacco companies would have been out of business 40 years ago, right? McDonald's would probably be out of business. So the fact is, you know, there's stories we can tell around what we do that are supported by data, but the data itself is not enough. So I'll close with this. You know, and I think it was Margaret Mead, right, who said, don't ever underestimate the power of a few committed individuals to change the world. In fact, that's the only thing that ever has, whether it was the framers of the Constitution in this country, you know, 250 years ago, or again, key individuals inside of organizations. So what I tell people, again, whether or not they want to be in sustainability, but who want to advance sustainability, is, you know, develop your capacity to lead change. We're talking about change here. We're talking about disruptive change. We're talking about transformative change. So get comfortable with the idea of change and get others comfortable with it. Again, think strategically, but execute on goals. Strategy is great to kind of get people aligned on what we're talking about, but at the end of the day, you're working to more specific things. Really focus on being an excellent communicator and how you get others to care about what it is that you're trying to do. And then again, keep up with this evolving global context so that you can help internalize what that context means to your organization. I have the picture here. Actually, this was the graduating class of our first inaugural Executive Masters class last year. Actually, you'll see with the pink shoes there, our friend Thomas. So that's how we know each other. Actually, he was in the inaugural class. You know, at the end of the day, sustainability without success is just ambition. You know, we're here to make things happen, not just to be right about what we want to see. So anyway, I think I stayed almost on time. Any questions?
Go ahead, John.
Sure.
You brought up China and the issues that are facing China. Do you guys have I imagine you guys make product in China?
Some.
Yeah. Do you have a backup plan if the business is sharing with China in terms of where you could make those products? I don't know,
Sure.
It seems incredibly disruptive to the world economy.
Sure. The question is, you know, so do we have strong reliance on China for what we sell, and do we have a backup plan? So, you know, we have obviously a lot of operations in China. We have a lot of operations not in China. In fact, one key example to answer your question, about 4 years ago, Thailand experienced extreme flooding, more than they had in over 100 years. And our industry woke up to realize that about 80% of the world's hard drives are made in Thailand. And all of a sudden, nothing was coming in out of Thailand. And in fact, it wasn't just hard drives, like automotive parts, entire production chains for companies like Honda basically came to a halt. And so we basically realized we had not thought enough about what happens when, let's say, an entire country or that is otherwise relatively stable politically shuts down. And so because of that, we've now really looked at redundancy. We've done something specific for China, for example, what we call a water risk map. Again, there's a lot of water-related risk. in China that's going to lead to other kinds of risk, again, like forced migration, civil unrest, etc. And we've done a mapping of where are our key operations in China and how does that overlay with where there's the most extreme water risk. And as you would expect, actually, there's a pretty high correlation between the two. And so we're very much looking at that. What else? Yes?
For a student who wanted to go into sustainability, is there particular skill sets you would encourage them to develop coursework?
Great question. Yeah, so for somebody who wants to be in sustainability, so there are career paths, like mine, where people are, if you will, kind of the professional sustainability people. There's a variety of pathways. Honestly, most people who are in sustainability today obviously didn't get trained in it because we all kind of backed into it somehow. What I tell even students today is content and subject matter matters, but it's not what's most important to me. When I look at kind of who tends to do well and who I would want on my team, and when I help others interview for roles, etc. Again, we look for people who have that capacity to lead change, that capacity to work across organizational boundaries, who are kind of nimble enough to look at problems from a variety of ways. And then in terms of coursework, that can go anywhere from things like psychology and ethics to environmental science, to conservation biology. It kind of depends if they want to be more of a generalist. I'm a generalist. I'm an expert at nothing, but I'm relatively informed about many things. And then I work with and rely on many experts, again, in things like the chemical compositions of plastics or renewable energy for our facilities. And so I find people who are really interested in one thing or more the vertical versus the horizontal. So I would certainly ask kind of where their penchants are. And then of course, there are courses in the community colleges. There's entire degree programs at places like ASU, but on the undergrad, grad level, even PhD level for somebody who's interested in really going into the research and the science and the teaching of it. What else? You don't get a prize for many questions.
This is one I bring up with students, but I'm not sure how to answer this stuff. So right now, the U.S. economy is doing really well, and I've read that primarily the economy is doing well because we're becoming self-sufficient in fossil fuels. So we have found our own sources for natural gas and oil in North Dakota and other locations, and that's helped keep our economy really well. But at the same time, obviously, that has a cost based on the continual use of those fossil fuels. So, and Dell's based in the United States. I mean,
Texas.
We all benefit from having a healthy economy. So it's one of those.
Yeah, I mean, so the question is, how do we, if I can reframe your question a little bit, it often comes to when you look at the science and things like the science says something like we have to leave 80% of known fossil fuel reserves in the ground if we're going to meet what science says are safe levels of global emissions. We have to, and then, the economic argument is, well, we have to keep growing. We have to provide employment for future generations, and not just in the U.S. Actually, U.S. is a relatively slow-growing economy, slow-growing population. When you look at places like the Middle East, like Africa, like most places in Asia that are having population booms, and again, we've seen in all of these countries that have had hotspots, most of the unrest tends to come from unemployed youth, because frankly, if you're unemployed and you're desperate and you've got a lot of free times on your hand, you're more open to being radicalized, you're more open to, frankly, just taking to the streets. So what I would say, and this isn't necessarily my area of expertise, is that all the signs are that, in fact, the transition to a clean energy economy will actually yield economic growth, more so than, if you will, hanging on to a specific form of energy. I think what is fueling, if you will, economic output is access to abundant and relatively inexpensive energy. So now that you see, for example, in parts of the country where wind and solar or at either cost parity or in some cases cost advantage to things like natural gas or coal. It's a transition and it's uncomfortable and it's difficult and there's going to be a lot of displacement. I mean, coal doesn't really employ that many people anymore compared, solar now employs about 5 times as many people as coal does. But still, you've got entire communities in places like West Virginia, like Kentucky that are like they're, it's kind of like when you close a military base, right? There's a few people who work on the base and then there's a bunch of other ecosystem businesses around it that are dependent on the business that the base brings. So, that's what I talk about, this disruptive, uncomfortable change is, when you look out into the future, it's necessary and it's desirable, but the transitions are going to be hard and they need to be managed.
Hey, Dr. Dale, I think we need to move on.
Okay.
Yes, okay.
All right.
So,
Well, I'll be around if any of you have follow-up questions. And then actually I have a last slide in here with my contact info, any of you who want to contact me. But thanks so much for having me and making me part of your morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you.